The dawn over Midway on June 4, 1942, was deceptively calm, a thin blue line stretching across the Pacific as if the ocean itself had no idea that the greatest carrier ambush in naval history was minutes away from ignition. Aboard USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, however, the tension was a living thing. Coiled in ready rooms, humming through steel decks, pulsing behind every clipped order and every glance exchanged between pilots who understood that today, more than any other day, the entire fate of the Pacific hung on their shoulders. They didn't yet know that the decisive blow would take only 6 minutes, but they knew something else. The Japanese were coming, and the Americans were ready in a way the enemy did not suspect. Days before, in a cramped room at Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts of Station HYPO had broken enough of JN-25B to identify AF as Midway, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, northeast of the atoll, perfectly angled for a surprise counterstroke. Nagumo, commanding the elite 1st Air Fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, believed he was the hunter. In truth, he was already inside the trap. But the men who would spring it were not intelligence officers or admirals. They were the dive bomber crews sitting on the ready decks of Enterprise in Yorktown, adjusting parachute harnesses, checking bomb cradles, tightening the cords of their headsets. The SBD Dauntless was not a glamorous aircraft. It was slow, rugged, almost plain. Yet it was deadly when its pilots used altitude and precision to turn gravity itself into a weapon. Richard Dick Best of VB6 reviewed the attack profile for the 1,000th time. Climb to 18,000 or 20,000 feet, circle until the signal, then dive at a near vertical angle with split flaps deployed, keeping airspeed below structural breakage, but high enough to evade zero interception. Release at roughly 1,500 feet to ensure both accuracy and survival. It was mathematics mixed with muscle memory, and Best trusted both. But even he felt the weight of the moment. Around him, engines began to warm on the deck. Rumor circulated that a large Japanese attack force had already hit Midway earlier that morning, and that Marine defenders had suffered heavy losses. Still, something else simmered under the noise. A sense that fate was pushing events towards a single point, a narrow window when everything the Navy had prepared for would either work or fail. At 07:15, far across the ocean, Vice Admiral Nagumo received the report that shaped his doom. The first attack wave returning from Midway wanted a second strike. The scout planes he had sent out, too few, too late, had found nothing. Believing American carriers were not yet in range, he issued the order that history would immortalize as one of the most catastrophic decisions of the war. Rearmed the reserve strike for a second Midway attack. Armorers on Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu began hauling bombs across hangar decks. Fuel carts moved between tightly packed aircraft. Torpedoes were shifted, hoisted, refitted. The hangars became a maze of open fuel lines, loose detonators, and stacked ordnance. If a bomber were to hit them now, even just one, the result would be catastrophic. But Nagumo still did not know the American carriers were already in the perfect position to strike. The Americans didn't yet know exactly where Nagumo's force was either. That uncertainty defined the next 2 hours. SBD pilots circled blindly above the Pacific. Radio static hissed. Contacts came and went. Some squadrons turned the wrong way. Others descended too early. But as the clock neared 0830, a single chance discovery pulled everything into alignment. LTCDR Clarence McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, spotted the lone wake of the Arashi, a Japanese destroyer racing at full speed to rejoin the fleet after depth charging the submarine USS Nautilus. McCluskey turned toward its course, gambling that its frantic sprint pointed straight back to Kido Butai. It was a gamble that changed the world. While McCluskey's SBDs raced to destiny, The men aboard Enterprise and Yorktown who had stayed behind studied the horizon, feeling the weight of their comrades' odds. They knew the earlier American torpedo attacks had failed disastrously. VT-8 annihilated at wave-top height, not a single torpedo hit. VT-6 mauled, VT-3 torn apart. But their sacrifice, though tragic, pulled every defending Zero to low altitude. The upper sky, the dive bomber's kingdom, was suddenly unguarded. And as the clock crept past 0900, the impossible convergence finally occurred. Two Enterprise dive bomber groups, VS-6 and VB-6, and the Yorktown Squadron, VB-3, all approaching from different headings, different altitudes, different timing, all arrived simultaneously above the Japanese carriers at the exact moment when the hangar decks below were packed with refueled, rearmed aircraft and volatile ordnance. Destiny could not have arranged it more precisely. At 0918, McCluskey saw them, three Japanese carriers turning sharply, their decks littered with fueling lines, unguided bombs, torpedoes, and fully loaded strike aircraft, waiting for Nagumo's indecisive orders. The sight froze the breath in his lungs. This was it. This was the moment the entire Pacific campaign balanced upon. He keyed the mic, his voice steady, but electric with urgency. All planes, follow me. And as the Dauntless formations spread their dive brakes and began rolling inverted into the opening of their attack dives, the world shifted towards the 6 minutes that would shatter the Japanese First Air Fleet and rewrite the future of the war.
They would later call it luck, or fate, or providence. But for the men in the cockpits that morning, there was nothing mystical about what was happening. It was chaos held together by courage. American squadrons scattering across the Pacific in a series of uncoordinated, heartbreaking, almost suicidal attacks that accomplished nothing tactically yet achieved everything strategically. Before the dive bomber miracle of 0920 to 0926, the hours leading up to it were a gauntlet of failure, sacrifice, and desperate endurance. At 07, the first American attack wave rose from Midway itself. Marine SBDs from VM-SB 241, joined by a handful of B-17s and antiquated Vindicator dive bombers. They found Nagumo's carriers, but they were torn apart by Zero fighters, not one bomb hit. Minutes later, the B-26 torpedo bombers tried a low-level attack. One was shot down, one nearly crashed into the carrier Akagi, and the rest fled. Again, no hits. The sky was a killing field. Yet these attacks forced the Japanese to maneuver violently, disrupting landing patterns and scattering their recovering strike groups. Meanwhile, far to the east, the torpedo squadrons from the American carriers climbed into the sky. VT-8 from Hornet, VT-6 from Enterprise, and VT-3 from Yorktown. They knew they were slow, they knew they were vulnerable, but no one expected how complete the slaughter would be. VT-8 was the first to find the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his men, 15 TBD Devastators, into the jaws of the most elite Zero squadrons in the Pacific. They flew low, straight, unwavering, trying to close the distance to torpedo release range. They never stood a chance. Zero fighters ripped into the formation, cutting down plane after plane. The torpedo bombers burst into flame or smashed into the sea. Every one of VT-8 was lost except Ensign George Gay, who watched the disaster unfold from the water after ditching. Not one torpedo struck. Minutes later, VT-6 tried. Their fate was barely different. 14 Devastators were shot down. The same happened to VT-3. The Japanese fighters, already warmed by the earlier Midway attack, fell on them with ruthless precision. Their sacrifices bought something priceless that no pilot could feel yet: altitude. While torpedo bombers fought their doomed runs at 200 feet, every defending Zero stayed low to intercept them. Not a single fighter remained at 15,000 or 20,000 feet, the altitude where the dive bombers would soon appear. Meanwhile, the dive bomber and fighter escorts from Hornet, led by Stanhope Ring, veered too far north, missing the Japanese entirely. They wandered the ocean for hours before returning low on fuel, accomplishing nothing. To the men aboard Enterprise watching these scattered, disastrous attacks come and go, it seemed as though the battle was slipping away. Reports were contradictory, confusing. The torpedo attacks had failed. The Marine bombers had failed. The B-17s had failed. No Japanese carrier had even been touched. In the ready rooms, officers quietly wondered if Nimitz's gamble was collapsing. But above the sea, something else was happening. Something hidden inside the turbulence of error, loss, and sacrifice. McCluskey's SBDs circling at altitude had drifted farther west than intended. Yorktown's VB-3 had ended up separated from its fighter escorts. The Pacific winds that scattered the American formations were the same winds that pushed them unknowingly onto the right heading. Even the elusive Arashi, racing to rejoin Nagumo's fleet after attacking USS Nautilus, served as an unintended arrow pointing straight to Kido Butai. And Nagumo, unaware his fleet was under threat, was still juggling armed aircraft, switching ordnance, and maintaining combat air patrols at the worst possible altitudes. At around 0915, the first signs of convergence appeared. McCluskey's group spotted the wakes of maneuvering Japanese carriers, long white scars across the dark blue water. He ordered Enterprise's VS-6 to attack Kaga and VB-6 to follow him toward Akagi. Moments later, to the northeast, Yorktown's VB-3 under Max Leslie spotted the same ships from a different angle. 3 separate American squadrons approached 3 Japanese carriers from 3 directions with the same altitude advantage, the same open sky, and the same target-rich chaos below them. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, exhausted from 40 minutes of chasing low-flying torpedo planes, was still trapped at sea level, trying to regain height. They would never make it in time. At 0915, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into the first dive. At 0919, Gallagher's section followed. At 0920, Dick Best pushed the stick forward and felt his SBD tilt into a vertical drop, dive brakes clattering into position. The Americans had failed all morning, but their failures had carved a corridor straight to the perfect attack window. Down below, unaware that destruction was seconds away, Japanese deck crews were still pushing bombs across the hangar floors. Fuel lines lay unsealed. Torpedoes with exposed detonators were scattered next to fully fueled aircraft waiting to launch. Nakajima, an Aichi strike plane, sat wing to wing, packed with high-octane gasoline and 800-kilogram bombs. The carriers were not just targets. They were open fuel air bombs waiting for a spark. And the Dauntless squadrons, diving now through 18,000 feet of sky, were bringing that spark with them at the speed of gravity. At 0920, the 6-minute destruction of the Japanese First Air Fleet began.
At 9:20 a.m., the sky above the Pacific tore open as if history itself had been waiting for this exact moment. Clarence McCluskey rolled his SBD Dauntless inverted and let gravity take hold, the nose dropping into a near-vertical dive that pinned him to his seat and filled his canopy with the growing shape of the carrier Kaga below. Dive brakes screamed. The altimeter unwound in a blur. Every second of descent was a countdown, not just to the release point, but to the instant the entire balance of naval power in the Pacific would tilt forever. The Japanese didn't see them at first. Kaga was making a hard evasive turn to avoid the scattered remnants of earlier attacks, preparing her deck for a second stripe on Midway. Her hangars were stuffed with refueled aircraft, fuel lines lying open across the floor, bombs stacked on carts, torpedoes half-mounted. It was the single worst moment for a carrier to be caught. McCluskey's first bomb fell clean, arcing like a shard of sunlight toward Kaga's forward section. Behind him, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher and the rest of VS-6 followed one after another, forming a chain of falling steel. The Zeros were too low to respond. The ship's AA crews were too shocked, their guns shifting upward too late, their tracers carving harmless orange trails across the sky. The first explosion tore across Kaga's flight deck with the violence of a thunderbolt. A second bomb plunged deeper, punching into the hangar packed with armed planes and igniting fuel vapors that transformed the interior into a furnace. Then a third, then a fourth. Fire blossomed outward, engulfing everything. The aircraft waiting on deck, the crews scrambling for hoses, the open fuel lines spraying burning streams across the hangar plates. In moments, Kaga was a floating firestorm. At that same moment, at 9:22, Lieutenant Commander Dick Best of VB-6 peeled away from the Kaga attack and banked toward Akagi, McCluskey's intended target. But McCluskey's group had dived too early, and the Kaga was already overwhelmed. Best saw that only he and his two wingmen were positioned to hit the flagship of the entire Japanese carrier fleet. Akagi, pride of Kido Butai, was turning into the wind, preparing to launch aircraft armed with a deadly mix of torpedoes and bombs, planes that could have annihilated the American task forces. Best's dive began at roughly 18,500 feet. The SBD shuddered as he pushed the nose down, the ocean rising fast, the wind shrieking around the canopy. He held the dive at nearly 70 degrees, keeping the red and white deck of Akagi centered in his sight despite the intense G-forces threatening to blur his vision. Through the pressure haze, Best saw something that made his stomach tighten. Akagi's deck was cluttered with fully armed bombers. Just one well-placed strike could ignite a chain reaction capable of destroying the entire carrier. At 1,500 feet, he released his bomb. Time slowed. The 1,000-pound bomb cut through the air like a spear, disappearing into the bright red Hinomaru painted on the deck. Best pulled out of the dive so hard his vision tunneled to black. Seconds later, he heard the explosion. Not a single blast, but a rolling, thunderous detonation as his bomb pierced the flight deck, plunged into the hangar below, and detonated amid torpedoes, bombs, and gasoline-soaked aircraft. Akagi convulsed. A column of fire forced its way up through the deck, blasting debris into the sky. Secondary explosions rippled across the ship as fuel lines ignited. Within minutes, the carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack was engulfed in flames so intense they could be seen from miles away. Best's two wingmen missed their targets, but his single hit was fatal. The flagship of the Japanese carrier strike force would never recover. While Kaga and Akagi burned, a third disaster unfolded at 9:24. From the northeast, Yorktown's dive bomber squadron VB-3 arrived under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. Unlike the Enterprise groups, Leslie's planes carried no bombs. Their arming wires had snapped free during takeoff. But the rest of his squadron did, and they dropped onto Soryu with ruthless precision. The Japanese carrier was attempting to maneuver out of the line of fire, but the Dauntlesses plunged down like hawks. Bomb after bomb struck home. 3 direct hits ripped through Soryu's hangars, igniting aircraft, detonating loose ordnance, and turning the ship into a rising tower of smoke and fire. Explosions tore through the hull. Men scrambled across the deck, their bodies silhouetted by flame. In less than 4 minutes, Soryu was mortally wounded. By 9:26, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were burning out of control. The sea around them boiled with oil fires. Lifeboats and debris sank beneath black smoke. The Zeros returning from their defensive runs could only watch in stunned horror as the force that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months was obliterated in less time than it took to boil a pot of tea. On the American side, the pilots hardly understood the magnitude of what they had done. They were too busy escaping AA fire, too focused on reforming formations, too conscious of the fuel running low in their tanks. But deep inside every SBD cockpit, a truth pulsed beneath the adrenaline. They had done something impossible, something irreversible, something that would echo throughout the entire Pacific War. 6 minutes, that was all it took. 6 minutes to destroy half the Japanese carrier fleet. 6 minutes to end the momentum of the Empire of Japan. 6 minutes to turn the hunters of the Pacific into the hunted. And the Dauntless crews, climbing away from burning wreckage they could no longer see, had no idea that the world had just shifted under their wings.
When the first blooms of fire burst from Kaga's deck, the shock struck the Japanese command like a physical blow. But when Akagi erupted, when Soryu's silhouette twisted into a rising column of black smoke, the scale of the disaster crashed through the bridge of Hiryu with the weight of an ending already written. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood frozen for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity as the reports flooded in. Kaga burning uncontrollably, Soryu unable to contain internal explosions, Akagi's hangar decks consumed by a firestorm so intense that crews could not even approach the hatches. Only Hiryu remained operational, and every officer present understood instantly and with perfect clarity the First Air Fleet, the jewel of the Imperial Navy, the instrument that had carved Japan's early war victories across the Pacific, had been shattered in 6 minutes. Below decks, damage control crews fought a hopeless war. On Kaga, flames raced through corridors where fuel pooled ankle-deep, igniting faster than men could extinguish it. Aircraft loaded with bombs detonated in the hangar, blowing out bulkheads and turning steel into shrapnel. Captain Jisaku Okada ordered abandoned ship long before the fires reached the boilers because there was nothing left to save. On Soryu, the situation was nearly identical. Flames leaping from elevator shafts, aviation gasoline spraying like flaming rain as ruptured lines fed the inferno. Men tried to dump bombs overboard, but explosions ripped through the hangar first, sending bodies tumbling across the burning deck. By midday, Soryu's engines were failing, her list worsening. She would sink at 1913 that evening. Akagi's agony was slower, but no less fatal. Best's bomb had pierced the flight deck and detonated amid fully armed strike aircraft, torpedoes, and bombs in various stages of preparation. The central hangar became an open furnace, flames shooting through ventilation shafts. Every attempt to flood the magazines came too late. Water failed to reach the burning compartments, and the inferno intensified. Nagumo transferred his flag to Hiryu shortly after 10:30, stepping into a carrier that felt impossibly small compared to the annihilation surrounding it. He did not scream, he did not break, but the stunned silence clinging to him told every officer on the bridge what none dared speak aloud. The battle, and with it Japan's naval supremacy, was slipping beyond recovery. Yet Hiryu was not done. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, one of the bravest and most respected officers in the fleet, refused to accept defeat while one carrier remained capable of flight operations. Fighters were fueled, bombers armed, and at 10:57 the first counterstrike launched. 18 dive bombers followed minutes later by torpedo planes. Their target, the Yorktown. The Americans saw them coming, but they could not avoid the blow. At 12:20, bombs smashed into Yorktown's deck, blasting open her hangars and igniting fires that seemed certain to doom her. But Yorktown's crew fought like demons. Damage control officers restored power, rebalanced the ship, kept her afloat. When the second Japanese strike arrived at 14:30, this time torpedo planes, they found Yorktown still steaming and mistook her for another carrier entirely. 2 torpedoes struck. Yorktown shuddered. She stopped. She began to list. By mid-afternoon, she was out of the fight, though not yet sunk. On Hiryu, Yamaguchi heard the reports of success, his face tightening, not in triumph but in resolve, because he understood the cost. Hiryu was now the last carrier standing, and the American dive bombers, fueled again and rearmed aboard Enterprise and Hornet, were already searching. At 1700, they found her. The Dauntlesses of VB-3, VB-6, and VS-6, hardened by the morning's miracle, dove with the same precision that had destroyed 3 carriers hours earlier. Hiryu maneuvered frantically, wheeling hard over the ocean's blue mirror, but there was no escaping the storm descending through the golden afternoon light. One bomb struck near the midships elevator, detonating in the hangar. A second exploded near the bow. A third plunged into the rear hangar. A fourth ignited fuel stores that spread fire through every compartment. Within minutes, Hiryu was a burning silhouette against the horizon, wounded beyond salvation. Yamaguchi refused to abandon her. When the order came for officers to evacuate, he declined, choosing to go down with his ship along with Captain Tomio Kaku, believing it dishonorable to survive the loss of the fleet entrusted to them. Through the night, Hiryu burned, flames rising hundreds of feet into the air, and at sunrise on June 5th, she finally slipped beneath the waves, the last ship of Nagumo's first air fleet to die. With her went the final hope of Japanese victory at Midway. The destruction of 4 carriers in a single day erased Japan's offensive power, wiped out the core of its elite air crews, and shattered the strategic initiative it had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor. The men of the U.S. Navy would not fully grasp the scale of their triumph until much later,
but from the bridges of Enterprise and Hornet, from the weary cockpits of returning SBD pilots, from the smoke columns painting the sky where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu once ruled, one truth rang with absolute clarity. Kido Butai, the most formidable striking force ever assembled on the oceans, was dead, and the Pacific War had turned forever. When the smoke finally began to thin over the morning horizon of June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was no longer the same battlefield it had been at dawn. Hours earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had arrived at Midway as the undisputed master of carrier warfare. Its first air fleet undefeated, its pilots seasoned by 5 months of relentless victories stretching from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. But by the end of that single day, because of one 6-minute window of perfect alignment, Japan's naval dominance had ruptured beyond repair. Not even the men who had delivered the decisive blows fully understood what they had done. They were too tired, too wired, too focused on navigating home with empty fuel tanks and shattered nerves to comprehend the scale of history unfolding beneath their wings. Only later, through quiet analysis and grim tallying, did the truth emerge. The 6 minutes between 0920 and 0926 had saved the Pacific. The United States emerged from the battle with one carrier mortally wounded, Yorktown, and a handful of aircraft lost. Japan emerged with its frontline carrier force destroyed, its air arm amputated, and its strategic initiative gone forever. But to understand the magnitude of Midway's pivot, one must first understand what Japan lost beyond steel and fuel. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were not merely ships. They were floating academies, repositories of elite knowledge forged through a decade of naval aviation development. Their crews had trained together in years in synchronized strike doctrine, night operations, coordinated multi-wave attacks, and intricate deck handling procedures. They were irreplaceable. In the hours after the Dauntless squadrons departed, survivors aboard the Japanese ships attempted impossible tasks, flooding magazines, isolating infernos, jettisoning fuel lines, pushing aircraft overboard to clear burning decks, but no amount of bravery could reverse the chain reactions ignited by American bombs. On Kaga and Soryu, the hangars were charnel houses of high-octane gasoline and stacked ordnance. Explosions tore the ships open from within. On Akagi, the fire that began with Dick Best's single, perfectly placed hit spread with terrifying speed, leaping through elevator shafts, rupturing fuel tanks, and igniting torpedoes. Attempts to save her only fed the inferno. Hiryu's agony came later in the day. 4 bombs, each one a nail sealing the coffin of Japan's carrier aviation. With each burning vessel, Japan lost trained armorers, seasoned mechanics, flight deck handlers, tactical coordinators, communication specialists, navigators, veteran combat pilots. Thousands of men whose experience could not be reproduced in the desperate accelerated training programs of the later war years. Midway was not simply a loss of carriers, it was the destruction of an entire professional culture. Meanwhile, on the American side, the shock of victory slowly seeped into the routines of recovery. Aboard Enterprise, pilots staggered across decks in exhaustion, their faces wind-burned, their eyes hollow, but their movements steady. Some collapsed onto the steel plating, too tired even to speak. Others walked silently to the ready room, staring at the chalkboard where kill counts and losses were tallied. When the final numbers were written, a strange heavy quiet settled across the room. A silence not of celebration, but of realization. They had done it. They had slain the giant. Yet the cost had been paid not by them alone, but by the torpedo squadrons that had been annihilated buying them time, by the Marines who had flown into the teeth of Japanese fire over Midway, by the crews aboard Yorktown who fought to save their ship until exhaustion crushed them. Victory had not come from one strike, but from every desperate, doomed effort that created the narrow corridor through which fate could act. That truth resonated far beyond the immediate aftermath. Because Midway's significance was not simply in what was destroyed, but in what it prevented. Had Japan won at Midway, had Nagumo found the American carriers first, Pearl Harbor's last remaining strike force would likely have been obliterated. Hawaii would have been isolated. The U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been reduced to battleships and cruisers incapable of contesting Japanese expansion. Australia might have been cut off. The Guadalcanal campaign, a turning point still months away, might have been impossible. Instead, the opposite happened. With Japan crippled, the United States seized the initiative. American industry began to surge forward, launching new Essex-class carriers, churning out planes faster than Japan could shoot them down, training pilots in modern, systematic ways that Japan could never replicate. Midway did not end the war, but it ended Japan's ability to win the war. And at the center of it all, at the heart of the reversal that reshaped the world, were the Dauntless crews, pilots and gunners who dived through flak and fire, who lined up their bombs through sweat-blurred vision and screaming winds, who held the sticks steady even as the ocean rushed toward them at 250 knots, who released their weapons at the exact fraction of a second when physics, courage, and fate aligned. When future historians searched for the hinge of the Pacific War, they found those 6 minutes. When veterans spoke of the moment Japan's advance was finally broken, they spoke of the same 6 minutes. And when the men who were there looked back across decades of life, they remembered the thunderous silence after their bombs fell, the rising fireballs, the burning silhouettes of the carriers that had once terrorized the Pacific. 6 minutes, that was all. 6 minutes to destroy 3 carriers. 6 minutes to change the course of a continent. 6 minutes to turn the tide of a world war. The Pacific would never be the same.